Thank you, everyone, and welcome back to Riverside and the World History and Memory of Peace and War. On behalf of the Mission Inn Foundation, thank you for attending this speaker series, which is a featured element of our Toward Peace project, which explores the peace activism of Mission Inn founder Frank A. Miller, the history of the Mission Inn, and the legacies of both of those for us today. Last week, Emily McEwen introduced us to the little known history of Frank Miller's first attempt at developing a World War I memorial in Riverside. Tonight, we will hear first about other World War I memorials around the nation, and then take a closer look at Miller's second attempt at a memorial in Riverside. We are very proud that Toward Peace is made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can visit calhum.org, calhum.org, to learn more about them and the many fine programs they support throughout California. I would also like to thank our local sponsors, Judith Auth, Sally and Chuck Beatty, Kathy Wright and Dwight Tate, and Walter Parks. Now, some of you have heard this before because you've been with us on previous webinars, but I just wanted to give a few of the Zoom housekeeping reminders. Your microphones are muted and cameras are off. The chat function has also been disabled. You can ask questions through using the Q&A function on your taskbar. So you can post your questions at any time during the presentation. Mark and Vince will address them after the presentation. If you are having technical issues, please post something about that in the Q&A as well, and Jared or I will try to help you. So now it is my honor to introduce our speakers tonight. Art historian Mark Levitch is a researcher and writer in the Department of Photographs at the National Gallery of Art. In 2012, he founded the World War I Memorial Inventory Project with the aim of documenting all of the World War I memorials in the U.S. Levitch is the author of Pantheon de la Guerre, Reconfiguring a Panorama of the Great War, as well as several essays on World War I art and visual culture, including most recently, an essay on World War I memorials for the Cambridge History of American Literature and Culture of the First World War, which is slated to be published this month. His presentation tonight is World War I Memorials and the Dissipation of Memory. Following Mark's presentation, Dr. Vince Moses will present Frank A. Miller and the building of the Soldiers Memorial and Municipal Auditorium. Vince is a former director of the Riverside Metropolitan Museum, now known as the Museum of Riverside. He has published numerous museum catalogs and scholarly articles in journals as diverse as Harvard's Business History Review and the Journal of Church and State. His recent work, developed in concert with his wife Kate Whitmore, is Henry L.A. Jekyll, Architect of Eastern Skyscrapers and the California Style, 1895 to 1950. Now tonight we'll be doing something a little bit different than in previous presentations. Following Vince's presentation, he and Mark will engage each other in a bit of discussion, and then we will address your questions posted in the Q&A following that. So with that, if you all would please join me in welcoming Mark Levitch.
Thank you, Teresa, and good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm afraid that my internet connection is a little glitchy. So to prevent a sort of major technical malfunction, I have recorded my presentation, but I will rejoin you when Vince and I have our conversation. So with that, Jared, if you wouldn't mind cueing the PowerPoint, thanks.
World War I's low profile in the United States is poignantly ironic given the unprecedented effort made in its aftermath to ensure that it would be remembered. Armistice Day, which is now Veterans Day, and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier number among the staples of American commemorative culture that can be traced to the war. But the most salient reminders of the drive to remember the conflict are the several thousand memorials erected across the country in the 1920s and 30s, of which you see a few here. As Professor Stephen Trout has rightly noted, quote, if judged by the number and scale of public memorials that it inspired, the First World War produced an outpouring of pride and patriotism unparalleled in American history, end quote. Communities at all levels, from neighborhoods to states, felt compelled to mark the conflict, as did clubs, colleges, churches, synagogues, businesses, fraternal organizations, women's patriotic groups, and veterans groups, among others. Blanketing the landscape, these reminders of the war are ubiquitous, though today they frequently go unnoticed or unrecognized. This evening, I want to examine the drive to erect memorials in the war's aftermath, the impassioned debates surrounding what constituted appropriate memorial types, the myriad forms memorials assumed, and what constructions of the war they embodied. And finally, the memorial's collective failure, despite their omnipresence, to fix the war's place in American memory. Communities across the country began discussing how to commemorate the war immediately after the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. Though American losses paled in comparison to those of the major European combatants, the deaths of 116,000 Americans in uniform, almost all in 1918, shook the nation. At the same time, Americans had cause to celebrate. The country's comparatively short-lived participation proved decisive in ending the most horrific conflict in human history, and secured, per the soaring rhetoric of the day, an epical victory for democratic ideals. The art establishment urged communities not to rush to erect monuments, believing time would afford perspective on the conflict and allow for more studied and aesthetically informed decisions about how to commemorate it. The nation's artistic elite were desperate to forestall what they feared would be a repeat of the pattern of Civil War commemoration, the erection in town after town of nearly identical, uninspired, mass-produced soldier monuments, as seen here at the left, with Union and Confederate soldiers made by the same company. From the same mold, the American Federation of Arts, the nation's leading professional arts organization, published guidelines, seen at right, for would-be memorial sponsors, stressing the importance of erecting individual works of art and urging communities to consult professional artists and architects about selecting and locating monuments. In the end, scores of communities erected tasteful, classically inspired memorials. Here you see a few examples: a monumental column in Providence, a Tempietto in Atlantic City, and a triumphal arch in New Orleans. But on balance, the AFA's guidelines were largely ignored, especially outside of major cities. And the first great wave of hurried memorials in particular, while important as markers of a community's recognition of its wartime service members, were generally unimpressive, off-the-shelf productions. For communities eager to erect a sculptural memorial quickly, though constrained by modest budgets, the surest route was, just as after the Civil War, to purchase a stock sculpture from the vibrant commercial monument industry. This is the most popular of the mass-produced models, E. M. Viquesny's rather inartistic Spirit of the American Doughboy, which found its way to 140 towns in 35 states, coast to coast. In celebrating the common soldier, these so-called doughboy monuments echoed their Civil War predecessors. But while Civil War memorials mostly portrayed soldiers standing comfortably at parade rest, the majority of doughboys, as here, assume an active pose. Indeed, Viquesny's model offers a patently romanticized version of individual heroism at odds with World War I's mass slaughter and mechanized death. The doughboy charges over barbed wire, standing almost completely erect, and readies to hurl a grenade held aloft in his right hand while grasping his rifle in his left. In her study of American World War I memorial sculpture, art historian Jennifer Wingate found that fighting doughboys such as this figure comprise more than 60% of freestanding soldier memorials. In addition to the debate pitting commercial against artistic memorials, a second controversy involved the question of whether utilitarian or so-called living memorials could suitably commemorate the dead. Progressive reformers argued that the Great War was a new kind of conflict that demanded a new approach to commemoration. They advocated the construction of functional memorial buildings, such as community centers, libraries, schools, and auditoriums, as well as the development of recreational spaces, like parks and playgrounds, arguing that such memorials, by promoting civic harmony, would embody the ideals for which the war was fought. The Waikiki War Memorial Natatorium, an ocean water swimming pool pictured here, became one of the best-known living memorials. The natatorium's Beaux-Arts triumphal entryway at least nods to its memorial role. But many of the new utilitarian memorials offered minimal, if any, memorial elements or reflective space. And traditionalists criticized communities for using the memorial moniker as an opportunistic cover for desired municipal improvements. Despite the naysayers, communities across the country embraced living memorials. Kansas erected at least a dozen war memorial halls across the state in the 1920s, including this one at Left in Independence in 1923, and North Dakota constructed a whopping 23 World War memorial buildings that functioned as community houses or recreation centers, including one at Mandan, seen at right, which housed the state's largest indoor swimming pool. More pools. Functional memorials also proliferated at universities. Spectacular memorial chapels, dormitories, libraries, and bell towers offered the chance to marry the commemoration of fallen students with campus expansion and beautification. Here you see the University of Delaware's Georgian-style Memorial Library at left, and at right, Cornell's impressive collegiate Gothic-style World War I memorial grouping, which includes residential towers linked by a cloister. The war also gave rise to two entirely new species of useful collegiate memorials. Memorial student unions, which first appeared in the 1920s to serve as collegiate community centers, and vast memorial football stadiums, moneymakers that schools touted as shrines to both athleticism and patriotism. Memorial unions, like that at Iowa State, seen at bottom, usually have a reflective space dedicated to the school's war dead. But the memorial quotient at football stadiums varies greatly. The University of Illinois Stadium, seen at top, incorporates a distinguished colonnade of 200 columns bearing the names of students who died during the war. Here you see the colonnade on the facade, and these are the columns on the inside, and you can just sort of make out the names on each column. Meanwhile, many other stadiums are effectively memorials in name only. The rise of car culture in the 1920s was reflected in many living memorials. Victory drives and roads of remembrance were legion across the country, often marked with a monument at one end and lined with memorial trees bearing the names of wartime fatalities. Minneapolis's gracious 3-mile-long Victory Memorial Drive, seen at its 1921 dedication at left, is one of few such roadways that have survived virtually intact. Just as roads were needed, so were bridges. More than 100 memorial bridges were erected in the interwar period. Most were utilitarian, perhaps with the addition of a memorial plaque. But a handful elegantly integrated memorial design elements, such as this span in Aurora, Illinois at right, which features mourning figures by sculptor Emery Seidel. The most striking memorial projects are the grandiose memorial buildings constructed as centerpieces of refashioned downtowns in several American cities as part of the City Beautiful movement. You get a sense of this from this 1930 New York Times article, the deck of which reads, "The faces of our cities are altered as new walls and columns rise in tribute to fallen heroes." Unlike their utilitarian counterparts, these massive structures are more ceremonial than functional, and through their architectural and decorative programs, they suggest both the war's momentousness and the gravitas attendant upon its commemoration. Kansas City's Liberty Memorial, dedicated in 1926, is the grandest of them all. Home since 2014 to the National World War I Museum, it features a 217-foot-tall tower adorned with 4 soaring guardian figures and is topped with a simulated eternal flame. And here is one of the guardian figures visible. On the plaza below, 2 massive Assyrian-influenced sphinxes, Memory and Future, face each other, their heads veiled, and they are pictured here as well. Large funerary urns front the porticoed buildings that flank the tower, and the building's solemn interiors are adorned with World War I themed murals. Drawing on eclectic ancient sources, the memorial fuses the funereal and the mystical. Other such buildings, too, draw on sober ancient references to commemorate the war dead. Baltimore and St. Louis, seen at bottom, are severe neoclassical edifices, while the gargantuan Indiana Memorial is modeled after the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Employing the vocabulary of classicism, including references to ancient martial funereal rites, these civic structures support historian Jay Winter's argument that traditional approaches to commemorating World War I flourished after the conflict because they offered timeless comfort to those reckoning with modern loss. The adoption of living memorials to remember the war dead marked a major change in U.S. commemorative practice. But sculptural memorials, too, beyond stock doughboys, flourished. Because time is short, I want to look at a few works that resonate with this conference's peace theme. Only a handful of sculptures are avowedly anti-war, but they are powerful. Carl Ilava's The Thinking Doughboy in Gloversville, New York, at left, features a worn, seated soldier, his head bare, looking down at a German helmet grasped in his left hand. He is a brutalized figure who both reflects and questions the war's toll. At right, sculptor Joseph Polia's Orange, Massachusetts peace statue is more didactic. It depicts a returned soldier talking to a young boy, trying to ensure, as the plaque avers, that, quote, it shall not be again, end quote. Bashka Payev's Sacrifices of War is the most important anti-war work because, amazingly, it is Maine's official state memorial. The monumental relief portrays a mother figure, an allegory of civilization, clutching a child to her breast to protect it. Below them, on either side, 2 dead male bodies, one face up, one face down, are half submerged in the wave-like tumult of war. Swedish sculptor Carl Mills' Vision of Peace in St. Paul's City Hall is the runaway winner for most eclectic peace memorial. Inspired by a Native American ceremony he had attended, now one might say appropriated, Mills created a 38-foot-tall, 60-ton onyx sculpture that depicts what he envisioned as a Native American god of peace. To gild the lily, the sculpture sits on a slowly rotating base. The common element that links American World War I memorials of all types and sizes is a list of names of those who died, and often all who served. Indeed, the vast majority of memorials comprise nothing more than an honor roll, often a bronze plaque mounted on a wall, a boulder, or a stela. Here you see a few examples. While some Civil War monuments bear names, it was only after World War I that honor rolls became a regular feature of memorialization. Recording names on memorials marked a definitive turn toward honoring the service and sacrifice of the citizen soldier, a democratization of death linked to mass mobilization and conscription. As art historian Kirk Savage has noted, the recording of names on the war's memorials brought, quote, both the scale and irreducible individuality of loss into the commemorative landscape, end quote. From the handful of names listed on small-town memorials to the thousands recorded on large memorials, honor rolls endowed every memorial, whatever its form, with an element of the sacral, and transformed even mass-produced monuments into locally personalized memorials. So, who decided what memorials to erect, where they would be placed, and how they would be paid for? Community memorials were often spearheaded by grassroots organizations, including local chapters of veterans and patriotic organizations, women's clubs, and civic and ethnic groups. Veterans themselves exercised substantial power over war remembrance, including the sponsorship of hundreds of memorials. Their principal vehicle for doing so was the American Legion, which was formed in the immediate aftermath of the war. The Legion assumed a role as the self-anointed custodian of war memory and labored assiduously to ensure that the country did not forget the conflict. Working through local posts that by 1921 had been established in virtually every town and neighborhood, which posts themselves were usually memorials by virtue of being named after a local person killed in the war, as you see on the left, the Legion extolled the war experience for teaching masculine toughness, courage, and comradeship. The Legion's glorification of the individual warrior, as reflected in artist Harvey Dunn's cover for the American Legion Monthly, and the Legion's outsized influence over the war's memory doubtless contributed to the dominance of the fighting doughboy motif in sculptural memorials, like the one we viewed earlier. Women, too, played an influential role in the Great War commemorations, just as they had after the Civil War. Local chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution, American War Mothers, and women's auxiliaries to the veterans of foreign wars and to the American Legion sponsored innumerable memorials, organized remembrance ceremonies, and planted memorial trees. Here you see women from the Cadillac, Michigan DAR post at the 1922 dedication of a county memorial that they sponsored. And at right, in a more recent picture, you can see the DAR insignia on the memorial. Gold Star mothers, that is, mothers of war dead, formed an especially critical constituency in the post-war commemorative landscape and played integral roles at civic mourning rituals, such as memorial dedications. They were also honored by several memorials, portrayed as they had been in wartime propaganda, as patriotic figures who served the nation by selflessly sacrificing their sons. George Zolnay's Gold Star Monument in Nashville features a mother cradling a mortally wounded doughboy. Reminiscent of Michelangelo's Pietà, it invites a comparison between the sacrifices of Mary and a Gold Star mother, a comparison reinforced by the inscription on the base extolling patriotic sacrifice. It's hard to see, but it says, "I gave my best to make a better world, 1917-1918. The role of African Americans in the war is inexcusably little reflected in the interwar commemorative landscape. At left is the only single-figure African American soldier sculpture, which is located in the heart of Chicago's African American community. And in the Jim Crow South, African Americans were often either left off honor rolls or listed separately at the bottom and labeled by race, as seen in this plaque from Savannah. African Americans are down here. While the federal government was responsible for the vast endeavor of constructing World War I military cemeteries and monuments in Europe, a topic that would require a separate talk, domestically it sponsored only one very important project, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Inspired by similar memorials created in Great Britain and France in 1920, the Tomb of the Unknowns was dedicated at Arlington Cemetery on Armistice Day 1921, in one of the grandest spectacles in the history of American war remembrance. To most Americans, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier stood, and still stands, for patriotic service and sacrifice. But for others, it served as a subversive icon. American writer John Dos Passos, for instance, emphasized the horrors that the tomb masked through patriotic ritual, while pacifists presented the unknown soldier as a prisoner of his nationalistic commemoration. Though subject to sharply divided interpretations, the tomb nevertheless served as a de facto national memorial to the Great War, attracting millions of visitors between 1921 and World War II. A few final thoughts on the seemingly inverse relationship between the huge number of memorials and the scant memory of the war in the U.S. First, memorials in general, while intended to be permanent reminders, with few exceptions have short shelf lives. That's just the way memorials work. Second, World War II contributed mightily to supplanting Americans' memory of World War I at both the official and the popular level. Third, While the World War I memorials in the U.S. speak to the country's overwhelming desire to honor those who fought and died, the memorials, as we've seen, do not embody a single and enduring national narrative, but instead reflect contested understandings of the war's meaning, ranging as they do from triumphant to doleful to cynical to utterly practical. Finally, I want to suggest that the sheer number of local memorials contributed to the fragmentation and ultimately the dissipation of national memory of the war. Most memorials evince a proprietary sensibility, commemorating our boys. These importantly enabled communities to create memories of the conflict specific to their own context. But the insistence on narrowly honoring our boys also at times interfered with larger citywide, statewide, and even national commemorative plans. Most damning in this regard was a nascent post-war effort to erect a national World War memorial on the site of what is now the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. What might have been the first national war memorial in our country was thwarted when individual Army divisions refused to cede their right to erect monuments of their own in the Capitol for the sake of a national memorial. In the end, only the 1st and 2nd Divisions erected memorials, as you see here. I, for one, wonder how the war might have been remembered differently in the U.S. if instead of these two memorials, the nation had built an impressive National World War I memorial on the mall facing the White House. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vince Moses, and I want to thank Mark for his really erudite presentation while I figure out how to get to my slideshow from the beginning. Jared, can you help me out? I have the menu bar at the top.
Can you hear me, Vince?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Where did that slideshow?
Yep.
Two to the right of transitions?
Yeah, I know that, but it's underneath the.
Yeah, but once you hit that one, go one more to the right.
One more to the right.
You can't see. You're on animations right now. If you can go to the right to slideshow, towards the top, right under the.
Yeah, where your mouse cursor is, Vince.
Okay. It's right underneath the menu bar, Mark. That's my problem.
So one thing you can do too is if you can slide up on the left side to your first slide. Since I'm assuming the issue is that Zoom is covering some of this.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so click that first one.
Okay.
And now you should be able to start slide on your, if you go all the way to the bottom right of the screen.
Bottom right.
See where the question mark is? Right above it, there's a little icon that looks like a slide on the right. A little bit more to the right. You were just there. To the
Right
left, slideshow.
All right.
There you go.
Thank you. What we're going to try to do today is bring home those themes which Mark so eloquently delivered in his presentation to you by looking at Riverside's example of its own war memorial. And this is really a concrete example, literally. The Riverside Municipal Auditorium Soldiers Memorial History, also known as the Soldiers Memorial, originally Soldiers Memorial and Municipal Auditorium, or Civic Auditorium and Soldiers Memorial. The auditorium is a Riverside landmark designed by famed Michigan architects Arthur Benton of Los Angeles, G. Stanley Wilson. It's a steel reinforced poured concrete late mission revival style building, and was a war memorial to the 87 military members from Riverside County who died in service to the country and fallen from previous wars. Give you a kind of geographical location for it. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1978. It's in the Mission Inn Historic District along 7th Street National Register Historic District. And it was, in fact, renovated by the city of Riverside in 2011 and is still used as a venue. Let's look at a context for these memorials in line with Mark's presentation. The Soldiers Memorial in this case is a living memorial per Glassberg on the right, the place of the past in American memory. Echoing national trends, this group, and in Riverside particularly, prefer to living memorials such as a community buildings and gymnasium, park, etc., and wanted to reflect the local values of the community. But we also have to remember that war memorials were big business, and in Riverside, a potential tourist draw, especially for Frank Miller, who was the leading proponent of the memorial. And this slide is courtesy really of Emily McEwen. The drive was led by Frank Miller, and local agitation for a memorial commemorating Riverside's war dead began almost immediately after the armistice and continued until the Common Council, that is City Council, placed a $200,000 construction bond on the November 1925 ballot. Frank Miller kicked off the bond drive in early 25 by donating land at 7th and Lemon Streets in the growing Civic Center. Mark this, his agreement with the city called for a civic auditorium and soldiers memorial. Miller's demand for a combined auditorium and memorial reflected both his business interest and his long involvement in the international peace movement. As master of the Mission Inn, he saw an opportunity to promote tourism while putting his values to work in a permanent structure he thought would be dedicated to lasting peace. Riverside citizens backed him. In this regard, Riverside was really a progressive community in the sense that Mark indicated. They wanted a useful civic structure as a memorial. Well, here you go. This is the great man himself, Frank Augustus Miller, with his first wife, Isabella Hardenberg Miller. This is about 1905. And in this case, they're looking adoringly at Arthur Benton, architect, who was the designer of the mission wing of the Mission Inn and later our own memorial. Well, just after the bond language had been created, Eugene B. Criddle recognized that it had left out Soldiers Memorial. So he went in front of the Common Council, the City Council of Riverside, and said that the ordinance left people in the dark, and they really needed to pass a resolution that would clarify the fact that this was going to be a soldiers memorial as well. There was some controversy about that because the mayor and a couple of members of the council didn't believe that Miller meant it to be a memorial. So Criddle and E.P. Clark, who was the publisher of the Riverside Daily Press, brought forth documentation that showed Miller had a specified memorial in his offer more than one time. As soon as that was all complete, then the paper indicated how much this was a popular undertaking. Officials of the city and the county expressed themselves as favorable to the memorial plans. And here, the city school board agreed to delay its school improvement in order to give the right of way to the soldiers memorial. And the city pledged its commitment to the American Legion, again, as Mark pointed out, give them an opportunity to make a campaign for a project that is dearer to their hearts than any other that could possibly come before voters. And then the citizenry wanted to emphasize to the Common Council that this should be vital to the municipality and in fact ought to be a structure as well as a memorial, and that skill in architecture, acoustics, all other angles, as they said, should predominate. And the best architect chosen to design the auditorium as a monument in the civic interest. The result you see in front of here is what Benton felt. And incidentally, it's modeled after Mission Santa Barbara and late Moorish Mission Revival style. It's based on De Architectura, the 10 books of architecture by Marcus Vitruvius Paulo. Vitruvius was the great architect of the Roman imperial builders. The project gave Riverside a civic structure worthy of the Roman imperial builders in myth, symbol, construction, and monumentality. Steel reinforced poured concrete. It has a Moorish mission, almost ecclesiastical look, which you see the shield and the American eagle at the top of the center scallop parapet. This was the result. And let's look at it a bit. The cornerstone, the first inscription for the cornerstone approved by the Common Council read like this. It's right in the center of this slide. Erected AD 1927 in honor of those who by their service in the World War fought to establish enduring peace. Fought to establish enduring peace. It appears from that the auditorium would become one of those messages for lasting peace. Mark indicated that was the minority position among all those national memorials, but very important. Let's see what the final inscription read. For God and country, in commemoration of all who have served our country in time of war, erected AD 1927. And ironically, given the final inscription, the Soldiers Memorial and Municipal Auditorium does not contain an honor roll, which was indicated in the previous presentation, really didn't become the standing order until after sometime after the war. In this case, we did not have one. Time the bond was passed, though, the leading architects of Southern California, many of them vied for the commission. Riverside architects G. Stanley Wilson introduced an early Mission Revival plan. Robert Spurgeon, one of the great academically trained architects of Southern California in the 20s, submitted an elaborate Beaux-Arts Spanish colonial revival design in late spring 1926. Seeley Pillar, another local architect, Mission Revival. Pasadena architects Marston, Van Pelt, and Mayberry, very important, Pasadena, a Mediterranean revival design also. And then finally, because the Common Council couldn't decide on an architect, Miller suggested that Los Angeles architect and architect of the Mission Inn, Arthur B. Benton, team up with G. Stanley Wilson and resubmit a design and a plan for the building. They did so, and in July 24, 1926, they were selected. And you see here Benton's illustration of what he and Wilson proposed as architecture for the Civic Auditorium, Soldiers Memorial Municipal Auditorium. The article on the left with yellow highlight indicates the commission awarded to Benton and Wilson, and then the lower yellow highlighted section indicating that their instructions were to choose an architectural style that fit within the growing Civic Center in Riverside, and especially the Mission Inn. Well, a couple of construction drawings here of the construction of the Soldiers Memorial are from the Mission Inn Foundation. They printed these out for this presentation for me from 4x5 negatives. This is the northwest corner of the building under construction in 1927, and it shows you setting up the wooden slip forms for the structural concrete, or the steel reinforced poured concrete, with what some architectural historians refer to as a plank finish here. And as indicated, the auditorium sits right in the middle of the growing, burgeoning Riverside Civic Center, which had been designed by Arthur Benton and the great Myron Hunt, architect from Pasadena, at the recommendation of Frank Miller in 1912. You see here nearing completion is the west or tall tower. It's on the right side of your screen with the shadow of the man leaning forward. the three-tiered Churriguerest Tower of the Riverside First Congregational Church by Myron Hunt and engineered by Henry L.A. Jekyll in 1914 is in the middle ground. Here again is the hand of Frank Miller. Miller chaired the church building committee and the AIA competition that specified a Spanish Renaissance design, not Mission Revival, Spanish Renaissance design, and Myron Hunt was the only one to meet that. This opened in 1914, well ahead of the Soldiers Memorial Municipal Auditorium, which was in late Mission Revival style, but in the architecture of the Hispanicized Beaux-Arts plan of Benton and Hunt. Well, here's one of the major symbols reflecting the memorial status of this building, even though it's quite ecclesiastical in its appearance. Here's a cast concrete American eagle ready for installation atop the scalloped center parapet. And on the right-hand side of your screen, the eagle and shield represent the Great Seal of the United States. And here's one iteration of that Great Seal of the United States, the Pluribus Unum, the American eagle with that, what should be stars and stripes representative of the American Republic. Well, when this auditorium was completed, it was dedicated March 14th, 1929 at 1:30 p.m. to be exact. They chose the president of Scripps College in Claremont to be the speaker for this memorial, indicating the status of what Riverside had done. If you notice to the right side of the memorial itself, you do not see the YWCA, which will appear soon after the auditorium itself. Well, here's what they got. This is the dedication. This is about a 1932 view taken from the tower of the First Congregational Church, looking back across 7th Street or Mission and Avenue at the Soldiers Memorial and Municipal Auditorium, modeled after Mission Santa Barbara, a giant order in front, the American eagle and the shield right at the top of the parapet. This arcade is representative of Mission Santa Barbara. But to put this in context of that Beaux-Arts Civic Center, look to the left, you see a Byzantine dome at the back right underneath this orange arrow point. This is the first Church of Christ Scientist by Arthur Benton, 1901, several years prior to his design of the auditorium. This is a late 19th century architectural assemblage of the Mission Revival, what the great architectural historian, the late David Gebhard, called a 19th century style, and we'll see it up close in just a moment. Then on the right, dedicated a few months after the auditorium, is the YWCA by Julia Morgan, 1929. This is a Mediterranean revival after Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. And down to your left, you see the sunken garden, which has access to the basement venues of the auditorium. Here's that great view of Benton's 1901 First Church of Christ Scientist. And you see what I'm talking about as an assemblage. This is like the California building in the 1893 Great White City Exposition. The north facade is a classical ionic columns. You've got a Mission three-tiered tower. You have this Byzantine dome with clerestory windows. You have the Mission Santa Barbara arcade. And then, of course, Julia Morgan's Young Women's Christian Association flanking the auditorium. This is designed by her in 1929. It's part of her YWCA creations in the state of California. Riverside is quite privileged to have one of her designs. The auditorium interior, let's look at this. The language you see in front of you is from the National Register nomination in 1978. And it's an indicator to us on what the emphasis might have been or not might have been on the actual memorial aspect to the auditorium. Let's look at this. These are 3 art glass windows that you can see from inside the lobby. Looking back, you see 3 leaded glass or art glass windows. The scenes depicted in those relate to the California and Riverside history. Facing south, the window at the left depicts California mission life of the monks, Indians, that's 1978 language, Native Americans, mission arches. At the bottom of the window are two shields with symbolic motifs. The center window, and this is the one major aspect besides the cornerstone inscription of the memorial. The center window contains representations of 4 human figures, a female Red Cross nurse and 3 males dressed in military uniform. But it appears to have Riverside's Mount Rubidoux in the background with the Father Sarah cross. At the bottom of the central window are shields related to the American military motif scenes. And the right window, again, depicts the arrival of the Spanish to California soldiers, missionaries, and Native Americans. So keep in mind, where is the emphasis on memorial in all of this related to the mission myth? Well, here's the interior. This is after the renovation in 2011, I believe. This is a major main auditorium, and there's a debate over this at the time, and it was designed by Benton and Wilson as a multi-purpose space. Could be a dance floor, could be tables down there, or it could seat a full 2,000 people when that is fully set up as an audience venue. Again, reflecting the architectural motif of those Ionic pilasters. And this is Deaver Hall. This is the main hall in the second floor of the auditorium. This is named after Lieutenant Charles Deaver, who was a popular high school student in Riverside before he went off to USC and then off to his professional career. And you notice the mission myth again with these architectural or these Spanish style murals that we think a local designer, Carl Runo, may have painted. And this thanks to local historian Steve Leck. This is a photograph of Lieutenant Charles Deaver and a photograph of the memorial in Meuse, Argonne, France, showing his name on the memorial. He was commander of a machine gun unit, and he died in 1918 going over the top. What they discovered later was perhaps mustard gas poisoning. The city of Riverside and the citizens decided they wanted to name that hall after Lieutenant Charles Deaver because of his earlier popularity in the city. Well, we had that World War I memorial auditorium and so dedicated soldiers. We also had a proposed World War II memorial by Henry L. A. Jekyll. I want to show you this and one other as comparison to the living memorial. Henry Jekyll, who was engineer on the First Congregational Church, was a well-known architect in town, and he did a pro bono design for the mayor and committee of a World War II memorial, a pure memorial with honor roll, as you see in the cross section. Down at the bottom of the leaded glass arched windows would be the honor roll. It was not built because of competing interest and the desire to wait for soldiers coming back from World War II. So this was never built. It was proposed. And the citizens of the community insisted that there be a roll of honor in this memorial, and they would subscribe to it and make certain that it could be built, though it was set aside until soldiers returned and therefore never built. We did, however, get a World War II memorial in about 1972. This was at the completion of the new City Hall at the end of Main Street going into 10th Street. It was focused on Ishmael Smiley Villegas that you see here on either side of the statue in the middle. He had been a 19-year-old lemon picker from Casablanca in Riverside. He died in heroic battle in Luzon, the Philippines, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. And in the early 1970s, artist, sculptor created this statue monument to him, along with an honor roll that you see in the background to the right of those soldiers from the area in World War II. So this is one of those standing memorials to the war dead, focused on the great hero from Riverside from World War II, Luzon, Philippines. And that then allows us to compare World War I living memorial and functioning civic auditorium that you see in the left. And as Mark indicated in his presentation, the memory of the auditorium as a memorial is slowly dissipating. There's not much in that auditorium other than the representation of the Great Seal at the top of that scallop, and those 3 leaded glass windows inside and Beaver Hall. Otherwise, it's best known in Riverside as a venue for events and conferences and activities. And on the right, you see the World War II commemorative memorial to the war dead in Riverside. Living memorial, World War I, commemorative memorial on the right for World War II. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's my presentation, and we will stop share. So perhaps Mark and I might have a little conversation. Hello,
Yeah.
Mark.
Hi, Vince. Nice. Thanks for the great presentation. I think our talks dovetailed a lot together. We touched on some similar things, I think, especially the idea of the living memorials, and also the idea of sort of a memorial building as sort of a part of a larger civic structure, like when I touched on the City Beautiful stuff that was going on with some memorial buildings elsewhere. So I think you pretty much laid out the case, but I'm wondering how much you think the Riverside Auditorium, it's not really perceived, it sounds like, so much anymore as a soldier's memorial, compared to sort of the World War II memorial that you talked about. But do you think that's changed over time? Do you get a sense? I'm a little surprised, actually, that the original thought for the inscription on the cornerstone was going to be World War I only, and then that got changed to all veterans. I do see that on a fair number of memorials, but I'm wondering if that is sort of a function of how long it took to build the memorial, or sort of other inputs, if you have any idea about that.
I think the best I've been able to determine is that there were competing interests in that description of and design of the memorial and what it was supposed to accomplish. That initial draft, I really believe, reflected what Frank Miller intended for this combined civic auditorium and soldiers memorial, because at the end, this is dedicated to those who fought to establish an enduring peace, which dovetails with Frank Miller's involvement in the international peace movement before World War I, and then maybe going over more of an institutional kind of approach afterward. But I think that reflected a lot of what he wanted to see in the end. Now, by the time this opened, Miller had been off to Asia. I don't know what happened in between, but that second final inscription changes completely. It's for God and country and all those that have participated on behalf of the country in war, something to that effect. So I found that juxtaposition kind of interesting. Initially, for the first several years, probably leading up to World War II, there was no doubt in anybody's mind that this was the Soldiers Memorial and Civic Auditorium. Everyone understood it. Afterward, probably in the last half of the 20th century, it became more and more, less and less of a reflection of memory of World War I and more of a civic venue, which it still serves as that now. So it's the kind of dissipation of memory that you're talking about. Today, I think most people just understand it as the Riverside Municipal Auditorium.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, though, you said in your presentation that national monument to World War I was never built because of all of those divisions, military divisions that wouldn't give up their own. I think I heard somewhere that there's going to be a national monument. There is a national monument out of World War I. Can you enlighten us on that?
Yeah, it's kind of a fun, convoluted story, but and sort of in the run up to the centennial of the war, people started thinking, oh, we now have memorials in DC to the Vietnam War, and then the Korean, and then World War II. And so isn't it time for there to be a a National World War I memorial in DC? And there was a push to put it on the mall, and that was nixed because we're not supposed to be building more things on the mall. And then there's a local Washington, DC memorial on the mall. And so there was sort of a talk of maybe nationalizing that, sort of making that a DC and National World War I memorial. We in Washington, D.C., who have no representation in Congress, we sort of see that as our local, we do our bit, and we don't really want this to be nationalized. And so it turns out that there is a park about a square block, a long block away from the White House, that is dedicated to General Pershing, who was the commander of U.S. troops in World War I, that's been there since the 80s, and it's been a little tired. And so that was seen as a spot that could sort of be the place for a new National World War I memorial in D.C. And that is essentially, long story short, that is what's happening. It was hoped that would be completed by 2018, by sort of the end of the centennial of the war. And it wasn't, but the renovated park is to be dedicated next month. They're raising a flag over it. And so I encourage people to sort of pay attention to that. The major sculptural element that will mark it as a World War I memorial will not be ready for a few more years, 2023 or 2024. And the only other thing I would say about that is that that big building in Kansas City, the Liberty Memorial, that is now the National World War I Museum, there was sort of an agreement between everyone that would also be a National World War I memorial. So that's actually technically the National World War I Museum and Memorial. And now we're going to have two National World War I memorials. So we've increased exponentially.
Well, just one more question. I know that Teresa probably want to get to the audience, but as an art historian, have you seen any renewed interest in the conservation of these monuments that have seen a lot of wear and tear?
Yeah, it's been it's really amazing that these are all 100 years old or soon to be, and the sculptures and stuff, anything that is outdoors, including the sculptures, have require regular conservation. That is just sort of, they need to be clean, they need to be waxed, things like that. And when people put up memorials, they usually don't realize that they have to have major money set aside to keep this thing up. But what's really been hurting, I think, are the memorial buildings, because a lot of them, were built to be sort of state of the art in the 1920s with their swimming pools, for instance. And that stuff does not last long, sort of infrastructure wise. And so I've seen a lot of memorial buildings that have become white elephants. Some have been razed altogether, and others sit empty, sort of waiting for proposals to, figure out what can be done with them to make them sort of more relevant now. And so that leads me to the Riverside Auditorium. What is that? How has that been maintained?
Well, in 2011, the city of Riverside renovated and retrofitted, seismically retrofitted the building with the intention of maintaining it as a usable venue as part of the city's offerings, along with the convention center and the Fox Performing Arts Center. So this still functions as that. It's part of the city's offering. So they did a seismic retrofit, even though this is a steel reinforced concrete building. They had to do seismic retrofit and restored and renovated a lot of the interior of the building. So it's really in good shape and still able to be used, but they had to wire it, which was very difficult in steel reinforced poured concrete building. You have to find ways to do that, bring it up to code, bring it up to current kind of digital capacity. So that's going on, but we are fortunate in the sense the city owns it and was able to do that.
That's great.
to maintain it.
That's super.
So shall we release our conversation to Teresa so she can get to the audience?
Yeah, I think we better.
Okay, so thank you both very much. That's really fascinating. And Mark, I now have, for when we can all travel again, I now have an agenda for future trips throughout the country. And Vince, thank you for that in-depth look. And I want to say especially thank you for highlighting that draft inscription. And I think you're absolutely right that it is very reflective of Frank Miller's intentions at the time. So we do have several questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get right to those. Just a second. There we go. So I think this one is probably for Mark. And someone asks, are there similarities? And you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could say a little more. Are there similarities in the memorials in the U.S. to the ones in France and Great Britain?
Broadly speaking, yes. Similar trends. There are memorial buildings in the UK, certainly with names on memorials. That is sort of a regular thing in both places. Memorials are sort of, in France, the sort of local governments had more of a role. There weren't as many sort of, veterans groups and women's groups and things like that involved in the construction of memorials. But yeah, broadly speaking, and they, I say we have thousands of memorials. They have tens of thousands of memorials. So, vastly outpacing ours. And I actually got inspired to sort of try to document ours by an effort that was going on in the UK to do the same.
Good, thank you. So this, I think, is for Vince. Eric Beecham asks, was Myron Hunt not interested in the memorial building or in designing the building?
There's never a mention of him participating or submitting anything in all the newspaper documentation I was able to review. I think he was plenty busy, though, in and around the Pasadena area. There's great demand. So that's the ghost coming in and out of the picture, if you see, is my wife, Kate. She's behind that.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't think that he really intended to submit a proposal because he was so busy with other commissions at the time.
Okay. So this is for Mark from Cortland Gendra, and she asked, do you feel like some of the scores of refurbishments of World War I memorials in the last 6 or 7 years might help reclaim some of the memory of the war in the U.S.?
Hi, Cortland. Yes, I think, the centennial has brought, I wouldn't say like a gargantuan spotlight thrown on World War I and its memorials, but certainly more than there was before. And there was an effort sponsored by the World War I Centennial Commission to help conserve, I think it was 50 memorials. And I know Cortland was involved closely, was instrumental in one of those. And so I do think it's helped. I think one thing that I would mention in particular is there's been much more attention given to the role, sort of the way that African Americans were treated in memorials, especially in the South. And many communities have gone back and done research and either put up integrated plaques, sort of removing the plaques that were segregated and putting them in museums, and putting up altogether new plaques, or at the very least putting up explanatory signage. And I think that's very important for the memory of the war. But yeah, I think there's been a lot of good work done on the memorials in the last few years.
So let's follow up. Cortland had a different question addressed to Dr. Moses. And this is regarding the honor roll in the Muse Argonne. And I don't remember, Vince, was that in your presentation?
Yeah, that was in my presentation. And the photograph is thanks to Steve Leck, by the way.
Okay.
Local.
What Cortland has a comment that the honor roll that you posted from the Muse Argonne is actually the wall of the missing at the Muse Argonne Cemetery in Romans-sur-Montfaucon, France. So
Okay, thank you, Cortland.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
So here's a general question, and I'll just see if either one of you want to address it. Rose Monhe asks, do you think it's important for a city to honor those who have died for their country in service? Are there commemorations for those who perished in the Vietnam War? And this, I mean, I think we all know about the big national Vietnam War memorial, but maybe in regard to anything, either of you know about local memorials, Vietnam memorials.
Mark, you want to take a first crack at that one?
Sure. I mean, I can talk generally that, there's definitely a trend. There are a lot of local memorials for the Vietnam War. And there has been a trend to sort of gathering memorials in communities because, some had Civil War, then some had World War I, and then some had World War II. Sometimes they were joined, sometimes there was Korea. So a lot of places, interestingly, are sort of, and they were often these memorials were in different parts of a city or town. And now there's been sort of a movement to put together sort of memorial parks where all of these can be gathered. And I would just mention very briefly that, the Vietnam Memorial in DC, the first national war memorial that we've had it's from 1982. It's not all that old. But Maya Lin was inspired by World War I memorials that listed names. And so that was sort of a going back to World War
I. Riverside does not have a Vietnam War memorial. The Arlington National Cemetery out near March Air Force Base is the closest thing to it with their commemoration of all the war dead in this area and military service members, but no direct memorial to the Vietnam War here.
And so I'd just like to follow up just a bit, Vince, in regard to the proposed World War II memorial, the one that wasn't built, and remind me who was the architect?
Henry Jekyll.
Oh, okay. And was there a location proposed with that as well?
The first location proposed was in that arched garden at the back of the Soldiers Memorial Municipal Auditorium, where the little fountain is located. G. Stanley Wilson didn't openly oppose that as far as I could tell, but it was rejected. And then when they were looking for another location when the memorial was set aside to wait for returning soldiers.
Okay, thank you. So this next one kind of dovetails into that again, a direct question or statement in regard to the Riverside Soldiers Memorial. This is from Steve Leck, our other local historian who's been on all the calls and has commented before sharing good information. So he comments that there are still a few reminders of the auditorium as a memorial. There are two quotes that meet the visitor in the front. This is the quote, "Behind us are their glories, before us still their dreams," unquote, on a coppery plaque that is between the two main doors. And then in the foyer, there is the quote, "There is no glory like his who saves his country." And then Steve comments, now whether these are understood anymore may be in doubt. So hopefully we're doing something about that tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
And Dwight Tate asks, was the municipal auditorium host to soldiers during World War II for social events like dances and maybe even a place to sleep?
Yes, places to sleep and USO shows, local USO. In fact, the Fox Theater was also open for places for soldiers to sleep. There's one great black and white historic photo of them all curled together on that, in the aisles and on the floor of the Fox Theater, another of the auditorium.
And then Peter Kalnin Vince has a question asking if you could say a few words about the Mount Rubidoux Peace Tower in the context of the presentation tonight.
Well, the Peace Tower is another monument that the exhibition is going to deal with, and Emily, I think, is really the expert on the Peace Tower. But this was a monument on Mount Rubidoux, the Peace Tower and Bridge, funded by the citizens of Riverside, friends of Frank Miller while he was away in Asia, Japan, ironically, commemorating his dedication to peace, 1926, and designed again by Arthur Benton. This is Miller's own architect until G. Stanley Wilson took over completely. So they're all linked in this regard. But the Peace Tower was a dedication to Frank Miller's commitment to international peace. And interestingly enough, as you'll find out in the exhibition, Miller was awarded the Fourth Order of the Rising Sun by Emperor Hirohito. Awarded to him then by the Consul General. That's quite interesting. It's probably in many ways appropriate that Miller passed before Pearl Harbor, because this whole issue in the 1920s with the Peace Tower and with the Order of the Rising Sun awarded to him for his efforts at peace while the Empire of Japan is rising behind the scenes is one of the great ironies.
So I see that note here that Sally Beatty would like to address this question live. So Sally, if that is in fact from you and you do want to add something, please unmute yourself. Sally. Okay. So if Sally has something, I hope she'll unmute herself and let me know that she has a comment on this. So let's see, would probably be for Vince from Lucy Hyming. Do you think that because the Riverside Memorial Auditorium is a functional memorial that helps it get the needed renovations? The community has a vested interest. Perhaps education of some sort would revive the original purpose.
I think serious education would. Steve would be a great guy in Open Doors Riverside to be a docent in the building for that purpose. And then even on the RMA website, there needs to be more about it too. They do have the short history, and I looked at some of that and sort of elaborated on it a bit in one of my slides. But education could really help to sort of repair memory, which is dissipated in that regard, and help explain those enigmatic quotes that were on the plaques inside the foyer of the building.
Okay.
Because it's a functioning auditorium is the reason why it was renovated, though, not because it's a memorial, but because it's a functioning venue of the city of Riverside. Mark, were you going to?
I was just going to say, I think that applies to many such memorials.
Yeah.
The education and the.
So Sally, have you unmuted yourself? Did you want to make a comment on that question?
I do. Go ahead, Chuck. Are we actually on? This is
You
Chuck.
are. That's not Sally, but Chuck Beatty,
Right.
former councilman, president of Friends of Mount Rubidoux. And Chuck, please make your comment.
Well, I'm noticing Joan, I've discovered, is also a native of Kansas City. And as a high school student, that was the prominent area of Kansas City as a memorial. And maybe Mark could comment, but we always identified the pose that was taken with the four major military leaders of World War I overlooking the great train station. I think of Pershing, I think of Beatty because of Beatty, two T's. The other two I can't remember. But having just visited the museum now, the last year or two, what changes have taken place since my youth? Maybe to comment on what happened. It was a memorial, I think, and now it's a great museum.
Yeah, it's a great story. I happen to have been born in Kansas City, and I didn't grow up there, but my family is there, and so I did used to go to the memorial as a kid,
Yeah.
which I'm sure sort of started my interest in World War One. But the memorial, it was one of a kind. It raised the city raised $2.5 million in 10 days. Which is the equivalent of about $35 million now. And this was in January 1919, I think. So they had the money to do it, and they went big. But by 1998, I think, I'm trying to think of the year, the memorial had to be closed because it was structurally unsound. Few people went. It's still this enormous thing. This is like we're talking about auditoriums, like these white elephants, and so it had to be closed, and it was unclear whether there would be funds available to renovate it, make it structurally sound, things like that. And they sort of doubled down, and they convinced the city to raise its sales tax, and they raised $103 million. And they dug underground and carved out the space for a new museum. So, when I showed that slide, you had these two flanking buildings, which are not small, but they're not big. But they dug underground so they could have a serious new museum. And that opened in 2004, I think. So that was that story. And it's been a huge success, and it has really itself contributed to sort of knowledge about the war and the memory of the war in a pretty big way. I think it's worth visiting. It's an amazing museum now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Chuck, did you have anything else?
No, I just said thank you, but I wonder if you might comment on who the other two leaders were. That picture sticks in my mind.
Yeah, it's Foch for France, and I forget the Belgian's name, but he's from Belgium.
Right.
And there's the great photo of it, and then they built a frieze of it on the side that faces the train station.
Oh, beautiful.
Mark, it's the dissipation of memory.
Okay, that was a great discussion. So Sally, just let me remind you to be sure to mute your mic so you and Chuck can keep having sidebar discussions.
Okay.
So that actually was very interesting, and it leads right into the next question, which I think you've kind of answered, but I wanted to share it because it's from Joan Donahue, who has, as the president of our local League of Women Voters, has been a participant in some of our programming on suffrage. So Joan, thank you for being here with us. And she also is a proud Kansas Citian. And so she had asked, and I think you've asked this, but if you want to say anything else, what's your assessment of the World War I Memorial in Kansas City? It's my hometown, and they are very proud of their recognition of the war to end all wars, which I think Chuck had just shared exactly that point.
Yeah, I mean, they should be rightly proud. It is a world-class museum. It's one of the top, I think, 20 most visited museums in the country, which is, pretty impressive. They have huge numbers, and they have an amazing collection. And one of the things I didn't have time to mention, I guess, in my presentation is that these memorial buildings that were more ceremonial, they also sort of intended to be museums. They were collecting things. So they have collected World War I memorabilia since 1920, and their collection is unbelievable.
So, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Vince.
I wanted to interject that. Remember, women have secured the vote by the time the Riverside Soldiers Memorial Municipal Auditorium the battle is underway to build it. Women leaders in Riverside played a very significant role. I mean, they were not on the common council and that sort of thing, but I don't know if you noticed in one of the slides, one of the leading women of the city was before the Common Council, making the argument for this as a civic structure commemorating the soldiers who did battle on behalf of the country. So it's important. I mean, we secured the vote. Now they're pushing that bond issue.
So just before we leave the Kansas City Memorial, I think this is Cortland Gendra has again shared some information, and I think that she's talking about these military leaders. That she's a Pershing. I guess Cortland is she. I'm sorry if Cortland is a he.
It's a he.
Oh, I'm sorry, Cortland. So Pershing from the USA, Beatty from the UK, Folk from France, Jacques from Belgium, and Diaz from Italy were the five military leaders on the wall with the bus. So thank you for that and for your patience with my misunderstanding. We do have a couple more questions. So for Mark, is the sculptural element coming in a few years to the World War I Memorial in DC? Will that be in the patriotic vein or more doleful?
Interesting question. It is a almost 60-foot long frieze with 38 figures, and it sort of tells the story across the frieze of a soldier being drafted, leaving his family, going to war, and then coming back after the war. So it's I guess it's more didactic, I would call it. It is supposed to sort of discuss sort of the major themes of to address the major themes of American involvement in the war from a soldier's perspective, but not from sort of arguably the larger societal effort that was required to participate in the war.
All right. So I think we'll have this be our last question for the evening. Is there anything either of you have noticed in memorial cultures about the interaction between those who have been sort of anti-war or anti-militarism and the peace movement, like those ideas held by Frank Miller?
Mark, broadly speaking, what do you think?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, I from what I have seen, there was, in literature in the 1920s, there's a lot about sort of the lost generation and sort of, the pointlessness of the war. Not so much in memorials. I showed you a few, and there are a few more, but it was not a common streak to emphasize peace in the memorials.
And keep in mind in Riverside that the Peace Tower and Bridge monument for Frank Miller's work is after the war, and it's dedicated to a lasting kind of international peace and his work in that regard. So that's an interesting thing. It's after the Soldiers Memorial and Municipal Auditorium it's before it's constructed. It's going on right about the same time as the design function for the World War I auditorium and memorial. Teresa, you might even interject if you know if there's any interrelation of the international peace activists. And there's kind of, if I understand it right, there's a kind of shift to patriotic duty after the United States enters the war. Our exhibit's going to deal with the pre-war international peace movement. And then by the time the U.S. enters the war, there's a hard shift toward the more patriotic effort. But then comes the peace monument on Mount Rubidoux for Frank Miller. But Teresa, I don't know.
Well, the only thing that's occurring to me is I'm wondering if anybody, you or any other local historians have seen any kind of an indication that the drive for the Peace Tower, because that was not him, that was
citizens,
members of the community and wanting to honor him, if that's in any kind of way a response to the sort of hollowing out of the memorial aspects of the auditorium. That would be a really interesting thing to follow up on. I have no idea if that's the case. Interesting speculation though. So any final comments from either of you? Nope. No.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank you again. It's been a really a fabulous night and a very interesting way to share national and local context. So for our audience who are still with us, thank you again for joining us, and be sure to come back next week when we will have a slightly different format. So next week, Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes of California Baptist University will be doing an author interview, and she will be interviewing Dr. Mona Siegel, who was paired with me on women's peace history. And Dr. Davis Hayes will interview Dr. Siegel on Dr. Siegel's book, Peace on Our Terms, The Global Battle for Women's Rights After the First World War. So that will be another new perspective on our topic. So thank you to Vince and Mark. What a wonderful evening. And thank you to all of our attendees, and everybody have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Mark. Bye,
Night.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.